When I say language police, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? You might think about political correctness, or maybe of dystopian fiction. But did you know that Canada's French province, Quebec, has an actual language police? Their goal is to enforce the language laws that keep Quebec French. These laws apply to schools and workplaces, as well as stores and restaurants. For example, if a shopkeeper wants to put up a sign in English without putting up an even bigger sign in French, that's illegal. And the language police take their job extremely seriously. Here, let me show you.
On Thursday, the Resto La Mama grilled cheese received a letter from Quebec's language police taking issue with 2 English words in the restaurant's signage.
Gone are the colorful spoons at Menchie's frozen yogurt shop in Dollard. Instead, patrons have to make do with these. The reason? A complaint to the province's language police over 4 little words. This is my mix.
Cooper says Quebec's language police have given her until March 10th to begin translating the Facebook page for her store in Chelsea to French.
This Italian bakery in Montreal's East End may face fines for using words like espresso or granita on their menu, words deemed not French enough.
Massimo Lecasse has separate French and English menus, but the French one has some Italian words because it's an Italian restaurant. Now, some of his dishes got him in trouble. Quebec's language watchdog went after him for words like pasta.
This might seem bizarre and tyrannical to you, especially because most Canadians can't actually speak French. So I'm gonna tell you exactly how this situation came about, and then we'll explore if the measures to keep French alive in Canada are essential to preserve the unique culture, or if they're disastrous forces of oppression. Like every other country in the Americas, Canada was populated long before the Europeans arrived. And as you can see here, it was home to multiple different indigenous language families. How many languages there were exactly, we don't know, but many. Then the Europeans arrived, specifically the French. And while most colonizers were absolute pieces of shit to native populations, it should be noted that the French in Canada were on relatively good terms with them. But that's mostly because they worked together to be pieces of shit to the animals, in particular the beavers. Because the French focused heavily on the fur trade with the natives, they didn't need a large French population there. They had a big colony on paper, it was called New France at the time, but in reality the British had a lot more people in North America. So, when the French and the British went to war, the British were able to take over this colony. This happened in 1763, a few hundred years after the French had first set foot on the land. So all the French colonizers who were living there suddenly became colonized people themselves. They were now living in a British colony. It's important to realize that at the time, that colony looked like this. It was really tiny compared to present-day Canada. So the British were living in the west and the French were living in the east. And surprisingly, they did not get along. The main differences were language and religion. The British were Protestants and the French were Catholics. And, well, the French were also still a little bit salty about, getting conquered. Not long after, the US became independent and many royalists moved from the US to Canada, so they could continue living in a British colony. And for about a century, Canada was just this much smaller country with an English-speaking population, the Anglophones, and a French-speaking population, the Francophones, who couldn't stand each other. But in 1896, they elected their first Francophone Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier. He was also fluent in English and familiar with both cultures, so a lot of people saw him as a uniting figure. And under his rule, Canada massively expanded its territory. From this to this. Now the map finally looks like Canada as we know it. But that's not the reason I'm telling you this. There are 2 reasons why this is important actually. Reason 1. Laurier wanted people to live on all this new land, so he welcomed millions of immigrants from all around the world. Everyone was welcome. Everyone! Well, as long as they were, white. A lot of those people didn't come from England or France, but they learned English over time, if they didn't already speak it. So even though the number of Francophones stayed the same, Francophones became a smaller part of the total population. Reason 2, this land wasn't empty. Natives were living there. Laurier just removed them from their land and forced them to live somewhere else. And not only that, he continued the program set up by his predecessors to civilize them. You know, what we now call cultural genocide. So while the French were allowed to keep their language, religion and culture, the most brutal methods were used to take all of that away from the natives. Children were separated from their parents and communities and sent to boarding schools, mostly run by churches. These schools completely stripped them of their identities, gave them new names, and forced them to speak English or French. Conditions were beyond horrific. Physical and sexual abuse was rampant, and some of the children were even experimented on. This continued for many decades. The last one of these schools only closed in 1997. In total, it's estimated that between 3,000 and 30,000 children died in these schools. Emphasis on children. Now this is gonna sound surreal, but while this was still going on, the Francophones developed the idea that they were the oppressed people of Canada. It can be hard to sympathize with them, knowing about the cultural genocide of the natives, the non-whites who were refused entry to Canada, and the white immigrants who were allowed in but had to learn a new language and adapt to a new culture. But let me tell you where the Francophones were coming from. They were still living in Quebec, which had remained a poor, rural, religious, underdeveloped province. And because they had never been forced to give up their language or culture, they continued to see themselves as French. But while they made up about 80% of the population of Quebec, the upper class consisted mainly of Anglophones. So they saw themselves as the exploited workers in an unfair system that benefited the Anglophones. Now there were two possible approaches to this problem. The first approach was to recognize that in order to get ahead in an English-speaking country with colonial ties to Britain and economic ties to the US, they had to learn English and adapt to the dominant culture. The second approach was domestic terrorism. Guess which one they picked?
Here was the beginning of real social upheaval. The people of Quebec saw that change was within their grasp.
Beginning in 1963, Le Front de Libération du Québec, better known as the FLQ, started bombing shit. Their goal was an independent and socialist Quebec, and a lot of Francophones supported them.
The National Revenue Building, the RCMP headquarters, the Canadian National Railways, the Black Watch Armory, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Queen Victoria Monument, La Grenade Shoe Factory, the Paul Sauvé Arena, Dominion Textiles, Standard Structural Steel, Eaton's, Murray Hill, Chambre de Transport, the Montreal City Hall, the Bank of Nova Scotia, the Quebec Ministry of Labour, the Canadian Army, the Montreal Stock Exchange, the Queen's Printer, the Chateau Frontenac, the Industrial Acceptance Corporation, Mayor Drapeau's residence, Loyola College, McGill University, the Bank of Montreal, and many others were bombed.
But there were also Francophones who condemned the violence and believed that Quebec should remain a part of Canada. One of those Francophones was Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau. And because many people believed that he could resolve this conflict, he was elected Prime Minister in 1968. The next year, the Canadian government adopted French as an official language. From that point on, everything the government did had to be in both English and French, because the law said that they were both equally important. But the FLQ still wasn't happy, so the year after that they kidnapped a British diplomat and the Deputy Premier of Quebec. In response, Pierre Trudeau declared the Canadian equivalent of martial law and arrested over 400 people without charges. Not the right people though, because he wasn't able to stop the kidnappers from murdering the Deputy Premier. After that, support for domestic terrorism among the Francophones went down. More peaceful attempts to separate Quebec from Canada followed, but they were never able to get a majority in referenda. They did, however, get a language police. So they were able to Frenchify the province by force. I showed you what this looks like in the beginning of the video, and it can be funny to see as an outsider. But it's not that funny to the people experiencing it. And we're not just talking about the upper class. A lot of regular people born and raised in Quebec no longer felt welcome in their own province. Quebec has a population of 8.5 million, and over the past 4 decades, 500,000 people have left. A mass exodus.
After a time, you just get worn down. You get just tired of hearing the same garbage, the same crap on the news every day, the same silly political games going on.
Just tired of waking up every morning to it on the news, in the newspapers, over and over without it ever finishing.
I have always been proud to be a Montrealer. I think it's the most beautiful city in Canada. And not to mention, this is my home, and I've lived here all my life. I'm sad that it's come to this pass.
Both Rose and I have always felt sort of, well, no, we're not going to give in. We're really not going to give in. All these other people have, but we're die hard. We're going to stick around. And here we go, huh?
Defenders of the language police say that they're necessary to preserve the French culture. But this raises many questions. Isn't it everyone's personal responsibility to preserve their own culture? Doesn't culture lose its value if it only exists because it's enforced by the government? Should anyone be forced to protect someone else's culture at the expense of their own? Can cultural preferences ever be a valid reason to restrict freedom of expression? Shouldn't the practical function of language as a communication tool overrule the cultural one? Should a provincial government be allowed to restrict the use of one of the country's official languages? Is restricting the use of other languages fair to people who want to learn those languages? Don't restrictions on languages that are used by others in the same country set people up for unnecessary conflicts? I could ask more questions, but I think you get the point. The language police is questionable. And then there's the fact that English and French have equality of status and equal rights and privileges as to their use in all institutions of the Parliament and Government of Canada, according to Canada's constitution. This sounds harmless, right? Maybe it even sounds good. But it comes with two major downsides. The first downside is that it elevates French above other minority languages, even in provinces where barely anyone speaks French. And if you're wondering how many of those provinces there are, just take a look at this graph. Francophones are a tiny minority in almost every province. Ontario is by far the most populous province, so let's take that as an example. 70% of people in Ontario speak English as their first language. You know what percentage speaks French as their first language? 4. Just 4. Same as the percentage of people whose first language is Chinese. So why should everyone learn English except for that 4%? The second downside is that it creates a francophone political elite. Because the federal government provides services in English and French, it needs employees who speak English and French. 43% of all federal positions now require fluency in both of these languages, and it becomes more important the higher up you get. Of course, in theory, anyone can learn both of these languages, but in practice, Francophones are overrepresented in those positions. These officials grew up speaking French and learned English because it's the most useful language in the world. But the other way around is a lot harder. Imagine motivating yourself to learn French as a second or third language just to appease a small minority. So, all in all, it's hard to view Canadian language laws as anything other than oppressive. They enforce the French language at the expense of freedom and equality. Canada should really do something about this, don't you think? Thank you so much for watching. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, just know that it's allowed. And it's free!